and then about some difficulties with pragmatism. Richard Bernstein, who is at Haverford College, used to teach at Yale. Richard Bernstein has written on quite a lot on pragmatism, trying to adopt pragmatist emphases in his own thinking, and in doing so has listed 5 contributions of pragmatism. Now, I take it these are contributions to his own thinking. You may not think them contributions, all of them, but some of them at least. The first is its rejection of foundationalism. And you're noticing how that theme keeps recurring. It'll be in the existential tradition as well, of course. The rejection of foundationalism, that tradition that comes down to us from Descartes of trying to logically deduce everything else from certain indubitable foundations. The second contribution, it's fallibilism. Fallibilism is the view that all human judgments are fallible, so that there is no logically indubitable certainty. And of course that's part of the rejection of foundationalism. But of course the pragmatist, accepting fallibilism, thinks that the pragmatic approach is a self-corrective process, because the active implementation and experimentation with an idea, like a hypothesis, is obviously going to be a corrective on premature overassurance, dogmatisms, so forth. The third contribution he lists is the social character of the self. That is to say, breaking with the isolated, atomistic view of an individual. Robinson Crusoe theory. And seeing the self rather as a locus within a whole complex of social relationships. This is particularly evident in Dewey. And I think it's understandable that in any Hegelian influence movement that you'll find this kind of renewed attempt to spell out the notion that we're social beings rather than isolated individuals. The atomism of the 18th century is rejected by virtue of the Hegelian kind of emergence of an individual in the course of history. If you like, going back to Hegel's conception of the concrete universal, the individual is the historical realization of universal possibilities from the past. So that universality and particularity combine in the individual. You remember Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis of universal, particular, individual. You see. And inasmuch as these universal possibilities are relationships to other humans within society, then the individual is that way. Just as a problem situation is not something isolated, but is posed by the whole network of relationships within which we exist. Biological relationships, psychological, sociological, environmental, so on and so forth. So that conception is significant. And tied to that, number 4, is the contingency in human life and human nature. Not only is life itself contingent on all sorts of things, but what I am as an individual is contingent on all sorts of things, genetic and environmental. And the same is true of human nature generically by virtue of Dewey's evolutionary naturalism, contingent on that evolutionary past. And then Bernstein's fifth contribution of pragmatism is its acceptance of pluralism, philosophical pluralism, ethical pluralism, religious pluralism, which is a phrase a lot of you are well familiar with after the conference last week. That is to say, an acceptance of the fact that a variety of different viewpoints coexist, among which it is impossible to choose with any kind of logical certainty. And so there's a relativism about alternative positions, except insofar as a belief is experientially verified. But of course, keep in mind that even experimental verification does not conclusively validate a position, simply because a pragmatic test commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. You're familiar with that. If in a hypothetical syllogism you're saying if A then B, and you say yes, B is correct, therefore A, you're affirming the consequent, which logically is fallacious. If it rains, I shall get wet. I'm getting wet, so it's raining. Not at all. Somebody could have turned the hose on. All sorts of other ways of getting wet. So that the pragmatic test operating this way may establish some, if you like, probability that A is true, in a traditional sense of true, but certainly no certainty. But then the pragmatist is not interested in certainty. He's not interested in the traditional sense of true. That contingency inevitably remains, and the pluralism remains. Well, this is saying that pragmatism is a kind of postmodernism. It's a kind of anti-realism. And certainly that's the direction in which it has subsequently been taken. I mentioned Richard Rorty, for instance, last time. And he is, I suppose, the anti-realist par excellence in contemporary thought. So these things, Bernstein's prepared to accept them all. I guess I'm prepared to buy the first 3.5, 4 of them. Rejection of foundationalism, fallibilism, the social character of the self, the contingency of human life, and so forth. My difficulties with pragmatism stem, of course, from its philosophical naturalism, from the underlying naturalism, by virtue of which there is no intrinsic value to anything that exists. This, of course, is one of the accompaniments of philosophical naturalism, unavoidably. The locus of value, of course, is likely to be what the individual values. And Dewey is explicit about that. He refuses to talk of what is valuable, that implies intrinsic value, and only talks of what is valued. So that loss of intrinsic value is a concern. if there are no intrinsic values, no, take it back, if there are intrinsic values, then obviously pragmatism, which is only concerned with relative values, is not enough. And the relationship between theory and practice is going to be a lot more than pragmatic because of the intrinsic value. But that leads to the second difficulty, that pragmatism's not only rejecting intrinsic values, but is accepting only the situational value of a belief or idea. So that every situation can be different, as if life is made up of a whole lot of discrete situations, each different from the other. It's a kind of atomism of its own. And as such, I think it fails to see the orderedness that there is in human existence. That is to say, there are universal kinds of situations, universal kinds of desire, therefore universal kinds of values, you see, interrelated within the unity of the whole. My complaint is that Dewey doesn't have enough of the interrelatedness. This is one of the consequences of naturalism. But if there are universal types of problem situations, universal human needs, values, then this is indicating something of a teleology that runs throughout human existence and nature, such as would imply that we have not just isolated problem situations, but an overall situation. The overall project of life has to be addressed. The meaning of life in toto, its purpose, not just what is desired in particular situations. So it seems to me the crux of the thing is the fact that naturalism denies intrinsic values, but once you get intrinsic values in an interrelated whole, you have a logos structure and a teleology, which is going to push you a lot beyond what a pragmatic method can accomplish. But let that be said in the context of certain appreciations. One other thing that I've long appreciated about pragmatism is its recognition of, talking of the intrinsic, an intrinsic connection between theory and practice. The tendency in Enlightenment thought is to think of theory for understanding's sake alone. And if there happens to be some application, well and good. Whereas I think one of the things I've learned from Dewey